They handed him a dusty rifle more out of courtesy than respect. A few young soldiers chuckled, assuming he'd miss, and he did. The instructor smirked, leaned to a recruit and whispered, "Let's not waste too much ammo." But then the old man, calm, weathered, forgotten, lifted the rifle again. This time no tremble, no rush, just breath and silence. When the shot rang out, the entire range froze. The target split clean through the center. No wind, no error. And when the base commander arrived, he didn't speak at first. He simply removed his cap, looked at the man, and said, "That name on the plaque inside, it never faded. And today, neither did your aim." He was the ghost behind a 40-year record, and today he returned. The morning sun had only just begun to lift the chill from the grass at Camp Whitmore, a mid-size army base tucked into the golden plains of central Montana. Wind whispered through the nearby pines, and beyond the gravel roads and shooting range, a line of recruits were already sweating through their first drills. Shouts of instructors echoed down the barracks while steel targets clanged faintly in the distance. For most of the young men and women there, it was another tough day in basic and another test, another push. But for Private Jake Lawrence this morning felt different. He kept glancing up from the formation, eyes darting toward the front gate. Then finally he saw it. A dusty Chevrolet Impala, faded blue and stubborn, against the years rolled up the side road, trailing a cloud of grit. The engine coughed to a stop near the range, and a tall, weathered man stepped out, his back stiff but upright. Walt Lawrence, Jake's grandfather, stood there in an old corduroy jacket, pressed slacks, and a flat wool cap pulled low over his brow. In one hand he carried a thermos of coffee. In the other, a well-worn cane that had seen more than its share of dirt roads and hospital hallways. Jake broke formation the moment he got the instructor's nod. He jogged over, chest puffed with pride, and a nervous grin tugging at his face. "Grandpa, you made it." Walt gave a slow, almost imperceptible smile. 3 hours on I-90 and the last 20 minutes on gravel. "But I made it," he said. "Had to see if they're teaching you kids right." From across the field, a few recruits took notice. One elbowed another and whispered, "Who's that, Grandpa? G.I. Joe." The remark drew a chuckle, nothing cruel, just the casual dismissiveness of the young toward the old. Walt didn't seem to hear, or maybe he did and chose not to react. His eyes moved calmly across the base, taking it in the way someone might revisit a home after decades away. Sergeant Holden, a no-nonsense instructor in his late 30s, approached Jake with a raised eyebrow. "Private Lawrence, this your visitor?" "Yes, sir," Jake said, straightening. "My grandfather, sir. He used to, well, he served." Holden nodded slowly. "Well, he's welcome to observe. Just keep him behind the line. It's marksmanship day." "Gets loud." Walt gave a small nod. "Understood. I won't get in the way." As Jake returned to his position, Walt found a metal folding chair near the firing line and eased into it. His hands rested on his cane. The sunlight caught the gray in his stubble, and for a moment he looked like a relic of another time, respected by few, recognized by none. Around him, young soldiers barely gave him a second glance. Just another old-timer tagging along. But Jake knew better. And before the day was over, so would everyone else. The early afternoon heat had started to rise, turning the scent of oil, sweat, and metal into something thick and familiar. The marksmanship test was well underway now. Targets stood tall across the field like silent witnesses. Recruits lined up one by one, firing under the stern eyes of their instructors. Jake was still down the line, prepping his stance, but Walt remained seated quietly near the edge of the range. He hadn't spoken much since arriving. Just sipped his coffee and watched. But there was something in his posture, his gaze, that made it clear he wasn't there to kill time. A group of recruits had gathered near the spare lane, Lane 9, where some of the old test rifles were set up for calibration or dry runs. It wasn't in active use, just there waiting. That's when Sergeant Daniels, a younger instructor with too much swagger and too little listening experience, wandered by and spotted Walt watching intently. "You ever shoot old-timer?" Daniels asked, half joking. Walt tilted his head. "Used to. Long time ago." Daniels glanced at the unused rifle resting on the bench. A classic bolt-action model, mostly for ceremonial practice now. "Well, we've got an open lane. Want to give it a try, just for fun?" Jake overheard from the next position and stiffened. His jaw clenched. He knew his grandfather could shoot, used to shoot, but he also knew Walt hadn't touched a rifle in years. Not since the accident, not since the surgeries. Time had a way of dulling even the sharpest edge. Still, Walt rose without a word. He approached Lane 9 like he belonged there, like it was a place he'd stood before. Jake watched, heart pounding harder than he expected. Walt set down his cane, rolled his shoulders slowly, then picked up the rifle. His movements were slow, careful. As he raised the weapon, a few nearby recruits started to murmur. "Is he actually going to try that better call a medic?" Daniels chuckled, clearly entertained. "All right, sir. Let's see what you've got." Walt adjusted his glasses, squinted down the range, took a breath, and fired. The shot rang out clean, but the sound of laughter followed quickly. A clean miss. Not just outside the bullseye, off the target completely. Daniels smirked and leaned toward one of the recruits. "Let's not waste too much ammo, huh?" Even Jake couldn't meet anyone's eye. His face was red, ears burning. He wanted to speak up, defend his grandfather, but the words didn't come. This wasn't a moment for arguing. This was one of those moments where silence grew heavier than noise. Walt, for his part, said nothing. He just nodded, slowly lowered the rifle, and rested it against the bench. His expression didn't show embarrassment, only thought, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. A breath, a rhythm. Then softly he said, "One more." Daniels blinked. Sir Walt didn't look at him. He just said it again. "One more." And this time everything changed. Walt didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for permission twice. Just those two simple words, "one more," spoken like a fact, not a request. For a second, Sergeant Daniels hesitated, still unsure whether to laugh or nod. But something in Walt's tone, calm, firm, like someone who had already made peace with the outcome, made the sergeant pause. He exchanged glances with another instructor, who gave a shrug. Then he said, half dismissive, "All right, one more." Walt stepped back to the line. Jake stood frozen, rifle lowered at his own station, watching his grandfather like it was the first time he'd really seen him. The others had gone quiet too. No more jokes, no more whispers, just that odd kind of anticipation that fills the space when no one knows what's coming next, but everyone senses it matters. Walt gripped the rifle differently this time. Not tighter, just deliberate. He adjusted his stance. One foot back slightly, shoulders squared. His knees didn't shake now. The cane still rested on the bench, but it looked like a relic of another man, one who'd been tired. Not the one now standing at lane 9. He ran his thumb along the stock, slow and steady, like tracing a memory carved in wood. Then came the silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty but full, heavy. Walt's breath slowed. In, out. He exhaled like he'd done this 1,000 times because he had. Not here, not now, but in places, in years no one around him could imagine. His inner voice said nothing. There was no doubt, no fear, no anticipation of applause. Just that muscle memory that never quite leaves the bones of those who've depended on it in life and death moments. He brought the rifle up. Eye on the sight. Target in the distance. The Montana wind held still. The world narrowed down to a single point. Click. Bang. The shot cracked through the range like thunder at the edge of a calm lake. Then nothing. No reaction. No mutter. No snide comment. Just eyes wide, mouths shut. Silence. Jake held his breath. Everyone else did too. Sergeant Daniels, his smirk long gone, stepped forward and adjusted the range scope, squinting into it like his life depended on what he saw. His posture stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. "Hit," someone whispered. Daniels didn't answer. He just stepped back from the scope and motioned for another instructor to take a look. Then another. One by one, they peered into the lens, each with the same reaction, stunned stillness. Finally, one of the younger recruits lifted a pair of binoculars and gasped. The bullseye's torn. Dead center. I mean dead center. The target had been split right through the middle. Not grazed, not near, but pierced so cleanly that it fluttered like someone had sliced it with a scalpel. Walt lowered the rifle slow and steady. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just turned toward Jake and said quietly, "That'll do," and the range still completely silent. The silence after the shot lingered long enough to become something else: reverence. Recruits no longer stood casually. Even Sergeant Daniels had taken a few steps back, arms folded now, expression unreadable. But across the range, leaning against the edge of the command shack, a grizzled figure had stopped mid-step. His name tag read Clayton. Master Sergeant, nearly retired. The kind of man who had forgotten more about military life than most of these kids would ever learn. And yet in that moment he was staring at the old man on lane 9 like he was seeing a ghost. He muttered under his breath, "Lawrence." Walt Lawrence. The name tickled something in the back of his mind. Not a rumor, a record. A rumor with documentation. Clayton turned sharply and strode across the gravel toward the main control building, an older structure with faded siding and a sagging flagpole out front. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper. A computer the size of a microwave blinked to life with a groan. He sat down, typed with thick fingers. Lawrence Walter, Fort Liberty, 1980s. After a slow scroll, the search engine blinked once match found. He clicked. Up popped a scanned file, grainy, faded, and yellowing at the edges. But clear enough. A black and white photo, a much younger Walt Lawrence, sunburned, lean, and kneeling beside a split target, nearly identical to the one outside, now fluttering in the breeze. Text beneath the image read, Fort Liberty Marksmanship Record, 1983. Longest standing open-range bullseye shot 200 meters. Confirmed, 1 shot 1 kill. Win variable, assist none. But the file didn't stop there. Clayton kept scrolling until he stopped cold. An after-action report. Short, stark. During recon patrol, Lawrence engaged from high ground without orders. Neutralized 3 hostile units drawing fire to cover wounded team. Held position 43 minutes. Rescued 2 pinned soldiers under suppressive fire. Refused citation. Declined Bronze Star. Clayton stared at the screen a full minute before printing the page. The paper came out, slow humming, like it felt the weight of what it carried. He folded it once carefully like it was something sacred. Outside recruits were still talking, but their tone had shifted. Who is he? Wait, what did the instructor call him? Lawrence. That's the guy. Even Daniels wasn't saying much now. He just stared at the torn bullseye like it had insulted him and inspired him all at once. Jake stood off to the side somewhere between pride and confusion. He'd grown up thinking his grandfather was a quiet man who fixed fences and drank his coffee black. He never imagined he'd be standing on a military range, hearing strangers whisper his family name with awe. Clayton emerged from the control building with the printout in hand. He didn't say a word, just handed the paper to Daniels, who read the header, paled slightly, and then slowly looked up at Walt, who was now quietly wiping down the rifle before placing it back in its canvas sleeve. Daniels stepped forward. Sir, is this you? Walt didn't answer at first, just zipped up the bag. Then glancing up through his weathered glasses, he replied, It was. No swagger, no pride, just truth. And in that moment, something shifted. The recruits, instructors, even the skeptical ones stood straighter. The target Walt had split wasn't just a bullseye anymore. It was history repeating itself in front of their eyes. The whispers grew rippling like wind through tall grass. He held that record, Fort Liberty sniper. That was him. That guy saved a whole unit. But Walt, he didn't seem to hear it. Or maybe he'd just learned long ago not to need the applause. The gravel outside Camp Whitmore's firing range crackled under the weight of thick tires. Heads turned as a black SUV with government plates and a small American flag decal rolled to a stop near the command post. The door opened with a heavy click, and out stepped a tall figure in neatly pressed fatigues, Colonel Richard Monroe, the base commander. He didn't bark orders. He didn't need to. The entire atmosphere shifted with his presence. Recruits straightened up. Instructors stood silent. Even Sergeant Daniels stepped aside, his earlier smirk completely gone. Colonel Monroe didn't head for the staff. He didn't ask questions. His eyes went straight to the older man sitting near lane 9, who was now calmly screwing the cap onto his thermos like nothing unusual had happened. Monroe approached without hurry, the wind lifting the edge of his coat as he stopped just a few feet in front of Walt Lawrence. Walt looked up slowly. The colonel stood still for a second longer than most would have expected. Then quietly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his cap. Sir, he said in a low voice, we've kept your plaque inside for 40 years, above the range office. Every year someone mentions your name, but most of us, We didn't know you were still alive. Walt gave a slow nod like someone acknowledging not just a fact, but the passing of time. I wasn't trying to be remembered, he replied evenly. Monroe studied him for a beat, then glanced toward the fluttering paper target still swaying at the end of the lane. That shot today, the colonel said, voice, tight with meaning, wasn't luck. He looked back at Walt. You never missed when it counted. Walt didn't smile. He didn't deny it either. He just sipped his coffee and looked off into the distance, like something out there was more important than praise. The wind picked up again, soft but steady, and with it came something else, a quiet respect. Not just from the colonel, but from the rows of recruits now watching, their faces unreadable. The man they had joked about hours ago was now the man their commanding officer addressed with reverence. Jake, standing behind the crowd, felt something rise in his chest, something he hadn't known was missing. Not pride in the accomplishment, but in the character of it. This wasn't just about a record. This was about a life lived without needing applause. Monroe extended his hand. Walt hesitated for only a second, then stood slowly without the cane and shook it. The colonel nodded once more, then quietly said, "If it's all right with you, sir, we'd like to hang that target next to your plaque." Walt looked toward the range. "It's just a piece of paper." The colonel smiled slightly. "That's not what it means." Walt gave a small shrug. "Do what you need to do." And with that, he sat back down, the moment passing like a wave, but leaving behind a silence that said more than any ceremony ever could. The sun was beginning to dip behind the Montana pines, casting long shadows across the gravel walkways and tan barrack buildings of Camp Whitmore. The range was quiet now. The recruits had been dismissed for chow, but Jake had asked to skip dinner. So had Walt. They walked slowly back to the edge of the barracks together, not saying much, just sharing the same silence that had hovered over the range hours earlier. Inside the common room, dim, quiet, and nearly empty, Jake pulled two folding chairs toward the back corner near a dusty window. Walt sat down slowly, setting his canvas rifle bag aside, then reached into the side pocket. "You ever wonder," he said, "why I never talked about any of it?" Jake looked at him. "Every day, Grandpa." Walt nodded faintly and pulled out a thin leather folder. It was cracked at the edges, the kind of thing that looked like it had lived through more than a few years of weather. He opened it slowly, laying it flat on the small table between them. Inside was a photograph, old, faded, sun-worn. It showed a younger Walt, not much older than Jake, was now crouching in a muddy field with two other soldiers. One of them had a bandage across his head. The other sat slumped in a wheelchair, saluting with what remained of his right arm. Walt had no medals on his chest in the photo, just a dirt-smeared face and eyes too tired for someone that young. Jake picked it up carefully. This is you," he whispered. "Who are the other guys?" Walt took a slow breath. "The one standing used to be Lieutenant Parker. Good kid. Got hit during that mission. The other was Corporal Dominguez. We pulled him out from under a flipped transport. He never walked again." Jake looked closer at the torn headline tucked behind the photo, "Sniper Rescues Wounded Under Fire Decline Citation." "You saved them?" Jake asked. "I tried," Walt replied. "Only Parker made it through the week." The weight in his voice was heavier than any rifle he had carried. He leaned back in his chair, gazed distant. "That day," he said, "I took the shot that ended the ambush. Got us out. Everyone called me a hero, but it didn't feel like a win, Jake. It felt like a trade. I walked out. Some didn't. That changes how you see yourself." Jake stayed quiet, letting it settle. "I stopped competing after that." Walt continued. "Didn't go back to the sniper program. Didn't chase medals or promotions. Just trained. Helped the next ones come up. Stayed behind the line." "Why?" Jake asked softly. "Because I was good at what I did. Too good. And when you carry a gift like that, when tied to loss, sometimes it stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like a burden." Jake stared at the photo again. "But you saved lives." Walt met his eyes. "That doesn't always balance the scale." They sat in silence for a moment. "I wish I'd known," Jake finally said. Walt gave a small smile. "You know now. That's enough." Then Jake did something he hadn't done in years. He reached over and wrapped his arms around his grandfather. No words. Just understanding. And on the table between the rifle bag and that worn photo, rested the quiet truth of a man who never needed the spotlight, only a reason to aim again. The next morning, the fog over Camp Whitmore hadn't yet lifted. Dew clung to the grass, and the metal benches lining the firing lanes glistened under the early light. The air was quiet, too early for yelling, too calm for drills, but Lane 9 was already set up. 4 recruits stood shoulder to shoulder, adjusting their stances, fidgeting with their rifles. They were the same 4 who had chuckled the day before. Now none of them smiled. Walt sat a few paces behind them on an old wooden bench, sipping black coffee from his battered thermos. He didn't give instructions. He didn't shout corrections. He didn't even have a rifle in his hands. But they all knew he was watching. Jake stood at the edge of the group, clipboard in hand, eyes focused but relaxed. He wasn't barking orders either, just repeating what Walt had taught him over the years in quiet lessons and calm afternoons. Don't fight the wind. Work with it. Let the rifle be part of your breath. One by one, the recruits fired, missed, adjusted, fired again, and slowly, and they started to hit. Not perfectly, not center, every time, but closer. Tighter groups. Less hesitation. Walt didn't move much, but every time one of them nailed a clean shot, his eyes narrowed just slightly. A small nod. No words but approval. They began to sense his presence, not as judgment, but as a silent guide. A reminder of where patience leads. Jake walked up beside his grandfather between rounds. They're listening now, he said quietly. They're trying now, Walt corrected him. There was a difference. 2 lanes over, Sergeant Daniels leaned against a post with arms crossed, watching the whole thing unfold. He hadn't said anything since the previous day's shock, but the look on his face had changed. Less smug, more curious, as if trying to understand how the old man had gotten into the heads of these recruits without saying a word. After a few rounds, one of the younger recruits, Mason, barely 19, lowered his rifle and glanced toward the bench. Sir, he called out awkwardly, am I holding it right? I keep drifting left. Walt looked up from his coffee and raised a hand, not to wave, but to motion him closer. Mason approached a little hesitant and stood in front of him like a student before a professor. Walt pointed to Mason's shoulder. You're not leaning into the rifle, he said simply. You're resisting it. Let it settle into you. Mason blinked, like, relax. Walt nodded. Exactly. You're trying to dominate it. That's not how good shots happen. Trust the stance. Let the rifle be an extension, not a fight. Mason went back and fired again. This time bullseye. He exhaled, turned around and met Walt's gaze. Walt didn't cheer, didn't clap, just nodded once. That nod said everything. By the time the sun was high, the 4 recruits had each put together the best rounds of their training so far. And Walt, he still hadn't touched a rifle. He didn't need to. His legacy was being passed on, not through medals, but through posture, breath, and the quiet belief that someone like him was still watching. The range had mostly cleared out by late morning. Recruits packed up their rifles, laughed softly among themselves, and left in small groups, some sneaking glances back toward the old bench where Walt Lawrence still sat quiet as ever, finishing the last of his coffee. The air was warmer now, the kind that hinted summer wasn't far off, but Walt didn't seem to notice. His eyes followed the wind moving through the trees, not the people. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Sergeant Daniels stood beside him, cap in hand. He didn't speak right away, just stood there a moment, like he was trying to find the right words. Walt didn't turn to look. He already knew who it was. Finally, Daniels cleared his throat. Sir, I wanted to say something. Walt raised an eyebrow slightly but stayed silent. Daniels shifted on his feet. Yesterday, I assumed. I looked at you and thought you were just, tagging along. A visitor. I didn't know I was standing next to the reason half our training manuals even exist. Walt finally turned his head, meeting Daniel's eyes. There was no resentment in his face, just a calm that comes from living long enough to understand human nature. We all do, Walt said evenly, until we learn not to. Daniels looked down for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. There wasn't much more to say. Walt extended a hand and Daniels took it. A firm grip, equal parts respect and humility. As Daniels turned to go, he paused and looked back. Just so you know, the target you hit yesterday, we framed it. It's going up next to the 1983 plaque. Walt raised an eyebrow. Still had that plaque, huh? Daniel smirked. We do now. Back inside the range office, the staff had already hung the new frame. It was simple, a clean bullseye target torn neatly through the center. Beneath it, a small brass plate, Walter Lawrence, Fort Liberty, 1983, returned in 2023. Still precise, still humble. They didn't add medals or headlines. They didn't need to, because sometimes a framed target says more than a speech ever could. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long amber rays across Camp Whitmore. The last warmth of the day bathed the main field in gold, and a gentle breeze tugged at the worn American flag above the old wooden pole near the barracks. Walt Lawrence sat beneath it on a weathered bench, his cane resting by his side. In his hands was a folded napkin and a fresh cup of coffee, black the way he always drank it. His eyes weren't on the cup, though. They were fixed far ahead, watching the shapes of young recruits down at the firing range. Jake sat beside him, quiet, his elbows on his knees. They didn't speak for a long while. The sound of distant gunfire rolled up from the range in soft waves, punctuated by commands, adjustments, corrections. Not frantic, not harsh. Just young voices learning the same lessons others had learned decades before. Walt didn't say much, but when he did, it came low and steady, like the earth itself speaking. Some legacies, he said, don't shout. Jake turned his head, listening. They just echo long enough. Walt continued for someone else to hear. Jake let the words hang in the air. He didn't respond right away, just looked out across the base, across the firing line at the new generation forming in real time. You think they'll remember you? Jake finally asked. Walt took a sip of his coffee. Doesn't matter. He glanced at Jake with a slight smile. They'll remember how they felt when that shot landed. They'll remember what it meant. And if I did it right, they'll pass it on without even knowing it. The flag above them snapped gently in the wind. Jake nodded, thoughtful. He didn't need to ask more. He understood now that legacies weren't just built by actions, they were carried by those willing to watch, learn, and eventually teach. Down on the range, a young recruit hit a clean center mark. Jake smiled. Walt didn't say anything, but he nodded once and looked back toward the flag. Because some stories don't need to be retold to matter. They just need to be remembered. As the sun set on Camp Whitmore and Walt Lawrence walked away from the range, something lingered in the air, far longer than the sound of that perfect shot. It wasn't just about marksmanship, it was about memory, about legacy, about quiet integrity in a noisy world. In today's fast-paced culture, where we're often pushed to speak louder, move faster, and chase attention, it's easy to forget the people who made the greatest impact often did so in silence. They weren't looking for followers or applause. They were focused on doing the right thing, even if no one noticed. Walt's story reminds us that strength doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it sits quietly on a bench, hands folded, eyes steady. There's a valuable lesson here for all of us, especially in these divided times. Maybe we don't need more shouting. Maybe what we need is more listening, more watching, more willingness to sit beside someone and say, "Tell me your story." So here's our question to you. Who's the Walt Lawrence in your life? Who taught you what strength looks like without ever raising their voice? Was it a parent, a coach, a fellow soldier, a neighbor who showed up when it mattered most? We'd love to hear your story in the comments. Let's fill this space not just with likes, but with living legacies, names, memories, and quiet heroes who shaped who we are today. If you found meaning in this story, consider subscribing to the channel. These are the stories we tell, the ones that might not make headlines but deserve to be heard. And if you know a veteran or someone who carries quiet strength, share this video with them. Let them know their story still matters. Because sometimes the shot that echoes the loudest is the one fired without fanfare, but never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for remembering. We'll see you in the next story.